Hey, Team Bio. Whoops. Okay, so today's screencast is about gas exchange. We've been talking pretty extensively about cellular respiration, and today we're going to connect cellular respiration at the microscopic level, what's happening at the level of the cell, to respiration at the level of the organism, how we accomplish gas exchange. Because as you all know by now, the chemical formula for cellular respiration is C6H12O6 plus oxygen. So we're taking glucose, we're combusting it with oxygen, and we are getting some CO2, a little H2O, and some energy in the form of ATP out. And so organisms that are undergoing cellular respiration have to figure out a way to get O2 in to their cells and CO2 out of their body, the waste product that's produced by their cells. So today we're going to be talking about how humans accomplish this task of exchanging gases, getting O2 in and CO2 out. And then next week we're going to do a little lab exploring what happens to our respiratory rate under different conditions. Okay, so yesterday, we talked about the heart and the flow of blood through the right and left chambers of the heart. And we talked about how the right side is getting blood from the body and pumping it to the lungs, and the left side is getting blood from the lungs and pumping it to the body. So these are actually two different kind of isolated circuits. I guess they're connected in two places through a network that is called capillaries. So the pulmonary circuit is receiving blood that is oxygen poor and CO2 rich. And in the lungs, we had to accomplish gas exchange. We need to get oxygen into the blood and CO2 out of the blood. And this is accomplished via simple diffusion. Okay, so your lungs are full of these structures that kind of looks like a bunch of grapes. The grapes are actually, instead of being full of juicy grape deliciousness, they are full of air. They are called alveoli. Single is alveolus. Or maybe I have that backwards. Anyway, you can look that up. Okay, so the alveoli are these little bunches of air sacs, and they are covered in a network of blood vessels called capillaries. Capillaries are teeny tiny little blood vessels that allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across them. So in the airspace within the lungs, oxygen concentration, I want to make this a little bit smaller. The oxygen concentration is going to be high relative to the blood vessel here, where O2 concentration is going to be low. So because this airspace has a higher concentration of oxygen than the blood within the capillary, oxygen is going to diffuse down its concentration gradient from the area of high concentration in the air into the area of low concentration, which is in the blood. Oop. Okay, running out of time. The opposite is true of carbon dioxide. In this situation, the CO2 levels when blood is entering the capillary network it's just been from the heart, before that it was in the body, it picked up a bunch of CO2. So the CO2 concentration in the blood is going to be very high relative to the CO2 concentration in the airspace, which is low. So CO2 just diffuses out of the blood into the airspace and will be exhaled. So This is how gas exchange takes place in the lungs. These molecules move from an area of high concentration to low, and gas exchange happens. So when the blood leaves the capillary network of the lungs and goes back to the heart here, so this is from heart, I guess I should do right heart, and this is to left heart. Now it is full of oxygen. And it doesn't have very much CO2 at all. Okay, the opposite is true. So now we've got our oxygenated blood, it's going back to the heart, and here it's going to be pumped from the heart to the whole body. This is called the systemic circuit, or sometimes it's called the systemic loop, and this can be called the pulmonary circuit or the pulmonary loop. Okay, so now we have oxygen-rich blood entering a capillary network within the body, and oxygen and CO2, so oxygen-rich CO2 blood entering the body. And if you were to take a human being and you were to take everything away except for the capillaries, you would just see like a shadow of the human with capillaries everywhere throughout their whole body. This is because every cell in the body is less than 100 micrometers, which is a millionth of a meter from a capillary. So maybe I should write that down. Every cell in body is less than 100 micrometers from a capillary. Because the exact opposite is happening in your body as was happening in your lungs. So in your body, the capillaries have a high O2 concentration, and your body cells have a low O2 concentration gradient, or low O2 concentration. So oxygen moves from your capillaries to your body cells. This is because body cells are constantly consuming oxygen all the time when they're performing cellular respiration. Remember, oxygen is picking up those low energy electrons at the end of the electron transport chain and is fusing with some hydrogen as well to become water. So oxygen is always being consumed. Okay, and then also in the capillaries, we have a CO2 concentration, which is lower than the body cells, because again, I put my arrow inside, should be outside. CO2 is constantly being produced in cellular respiration, so CO2 is going to diffuse from your body cells into your capillaries. So when your capillaries rejoin with venules, which are tiny veins, and then back to veins, and then ultimately back with the inferior and superior vena cava and empty back into the heart. Now we have oxygen poor blood and CO2 rich, because we've dropped off all the oxygen at our body cells and we've picked up a bunch of CO2 that was produced in cellular respiration. Okay, so something else you need to know is a bit about how O2 and CO2 are carried in the blood. So oxygen is transported by binding to hemoglobin. Which hemoglobin is a protein that your RBCs, which are your red blood cells, are full of. So oxygen is binding to hemoglobin, and when you take biochemistry, you'll learn all about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. We're not going to talk about that very much, but just know that hemoglobin, can bind oxygen, and it does so in the lungs, and then it gives it up in the body tissue. when O2 concentration gradient, or O2, is low in the tissue. And CO2 has a couple different ways it's transported through your body. But the primary way that CO2 is transported is it dissolves in water. So your blood is full of red blood cells, but also it's a mixture of blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and then plasma, which is full of lots of different things, antibodies and nutrients and glucose and all this stuff, but it's a watery solution. So dissolves in the H2O of your blood plasma. And when CO2 does that, when CO2 dissolves in water, it becomes carbonic acid. Any of you that drink bubbly seltzer drinks will know that they kind of have a tart flavor. If you have water and you put CO2 in it and make seltzer, it develops this kind of sharpness to it. And that's the carbonic acid that you're tasting. Sharp taste. So when CO2 dissolves in H2O, it becomes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is an acid. So when this happens, it changes the pH of your blood. So when you have a lot of CO2 in your blood becomes more acidic. And when you have very little CO2 in your blood becomes basic. Now, this all connects to your respiratory rate. Which is how often you're breathing. Usually we measure your respiratory rate as breaths per minute. So your respiratory rate is, most people just assume that your respiratory rate is controlled by the amount of oxygen in your blood. And it's true that the amount of dissolved oxygen in your blood does impact your respiratory rate, but that's more over the long term. The short-term control of your respiratory rate, or how strong your impulse to breathe is the result of the CO2 concentration of your blood. And that's because your respiratory rate is controlled by chemoreceptors in your brain. And these chemoreceptors are sensitive to the pH of your blood. Did I spell sensitive right? Let me look that up. No. Sensitive, not sensitive. Okay, sorry. Dyslexia. Okay, so chemoreceptors are sensitive to the pH of your blood. And what's determining the pH of your blood is how much CO2 is dissolved in it. So if you have acidic blood, then your brain is going to send a strong impulse to breathe. And if you have basic blood, then you have a very weak impulse to breathe. And by impulse to breathe, I mean, so the respiratory rate is interesting because it is somewhat under conscious control, right? You could tell your body, I want to take a breath right now, and you can take a breath. But you can also not think about breathing, and your body will still breathe. So your brain is constantly telling your body, your diaphragm, when to contract and take a breath. And that is going to be sensitive to the acidity of your blood and not the oxygen concentration of your blood in the short term. So this is all going to come into play in our lab on Monday. And I'm sorry I did that so small. Campbell's going to be upset at me. Hopefully this is a shorter screencast than in the past, because Ava has requested short screencasts. We'll see.